Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this international webinar series entitled Catalyzing the Impact of Research Through International Evidence-Based Knowledge Exchange. This is our third webinar, which is called Mental Health Challenges in Complex Modern Societies, the cases of Chile and the UK. These webinars and this series of webinars come from an ongoing collaboration between Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile in Chile, Universidad del Desarrollo in Chile, and Teesside University at the UK, who have recently developed a strong partnership to strengthen international teaching and research innovation. With this aim, this international webinar series aims at catalyzing the impact of research through international evidence-based knowledge exchange between these three universities, and in potential collaboration with other relevant institutions in England and Chile. These three universities, PUC, UDD, and TU, have planned a list of webinars related to selected topics of mutual interest. A total of 5 webinars will be executed monthly, generally every first Monday of the month via Zoom seminar provided by Universidad del Desarrollo with live streaming through UDD TV and YouTube UDD channel. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this very exciting and relevant public health matter, as it is mental health challenges in complex modern societies, the cases of Chile and the UK. My name is Baltica Cavieses. I'm a social epidemiologist and the director of the Global Intercultural Health Center, which is an interdisciplinary research team that is devoted to developing knowledge and transference of actions and innovations in public health matters related to global intercultural health. To start with our seminar, I will first introduce our first panelist, Alice Blukacs. Alice is a researcher on international migration and health in Latin America and Chile at UDD, political scientist with an MSc in international migration and public policy. Dear Alice, please welcome and join us to this panel session. Thank you for joining and accepting to share your knowledge and experience on mental health, in particular to migrant communities here in Chile and Latin America. Thank you for being with us today. I will ask our coordination team to stop sharing the flyer so that Alice can start sharing her presentation. Thank you so much for that. And dear Alice, you've got around 20 minutes to present to us and all those who are joining us today your wonderful experience around this topic. Thank you very much. And the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Baltica, for the introduction. So, hello, everyone. My name is Alice Blukacs. I'm a researcher at the Centro de Salud Global Intercultural at the Universidad del Desarrollo. And today I'm going to present about mental health of migrants and refugees in Latin America, the Caribbean, and specifically Chile. So to have a little bit of a look at what we're going to see today. So we're going to talk about first, have a look at what is migration and how is migration a social determinant of mental health. We're going to look at migration in Latin America and the Caribbean, kind of recent trends and changes and how all of these may relate to mental health. Then a quick look at challenges and opportunities for migration and mental health in the region. Then we're going to take a little bit of a dive into Chile as a case study, and then key takeaways, and finally recommended readings around the topic. So what is migration? First of all, migration is defined as the movement of persons outside their usual place of residence across an international border or within a country. So we're going to look at today at international migration, so people moving across international borders. And this excludes tourism, traveling for business, health treatments, or religious reasons. So it's people usually moving for a longer period of time. So migration is a human phenomenon. It has always existed. So when we hear that migration is new and something that we've never seen, that's just not true. It's something it's natural to human beings to kind of move around and and migrate, right? So people usually move for different reasons. So one of the main reasons is searching for new opportunities. So that's very broad. That can be for work, that can be for studying, economic opportunities, family reasons, a whole bunch of different reasons, which could be perceived as either kind of positive or negative. But we also hear a lot about forced migration, which is when people escape from their own country for, escaping conflict, escaping poverty or bad living conditions, or this sort of things. And also more and more we see people escaping environmental disasters. So this translates into different migratory trajectories where people move for different reasons, and they don't move in the same way. So there's different ways of migrating. So some people migrate by foot, they cross borders, they walk through borders, and they walk through different countries for many months. Some people just hop on a plane and just migrate to another country that way. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons and ways people do move. There's also a whole system of governance surrounding migration. So you have the governance of migration at the national level. So you have migration laws and policies, but you also have multilateral and bilateral agreements. For instance, we have the Schengen area in the EU. In Latin America, there's Mercosur with countries. Chile is included. You have Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Peru, and Bolivia, which means that migration can be made easier between these countries. You also have specific bilateral agreements, for instance, between Mexico and Canada for labor workers, etc. So these are some examples. And then you also have an international organization called the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which looks at migration worldwide. And you also have the Organization for Refugees, what's called the High Commissioner for Refugees. So you have a whole system of governance of migration at different levels. And finally, you also have something that is worth mentioning, which is also very related to, or can be very, very related to mental health, which is inclusion models. So how migrants are going to be included in the receiving society. So is it going to be through assimilation, which means completely adopting the new culture and leaving aside or leaving behind your own culture or cultures? Then you have multiculturalism, which is kind of model that is used currently in the UK in terms of acknowledging that there are other cultures and letting them be in a way. And then you have the next kind of level of inclusion, which would have to be with cross-cultural integration, where there's more of a dialogue, which emerges between different cultures and they kind of live in that way in a little bit more of a cohesive way. So this was just a quick introduction to kind of set the scene of what do we mean by migration? What is migration? So how does this relate to health? So or to mental health more specifically? So how is migration a social determinant of mental health? So when we look at the cycle of migration, so migration has different steps. So the first steps within the cycle of migration is pre-migration. So this is the moment where people are deciding, or not really deciding, that they're going to leave their country. So the pre-migration phase is really important, because this is where the reason for migration kind of emerges. So is someone moving because of a war, a conflict, because of violence, persecution, or economic hardship? Or is it because of a combination of those factors? Is it because of, is it for family reunification? Is it for studying? Is it for searching for new opportunities? So these are going to have different implications for mental health. So someone fleeing a war may have or will probably face different challenges than someone just moving abroad to study. So this it's very important when you look at the health of the mental health of international migrants. Why did they move, and in what conditions were they living in their country of origin, and why did they come to another country, right? Because this is going to have different implications probably for their mental health. Then we have to look at the transit phase, which is when literally when people are moving across borders to go to another country. So here we have to look at the transportation. So is it safe or unsafe? Is it, as I said before, is it someone just hopping on a plane and country A to country B and just, you know, very straightforward way of migrating? Or is it someone who, for instance, leaves their country by bus and then has to walk for a little bit and then hop on another bus, informal transportation, you know, kind of the safety issues that may arise during that kind of transit mode, yeah, right? There's also risk of physical harm that could arise during this sort of migration trajectory. We've also seen, unfortunately, instances of sexual abuse, threat to life, and also some people, unfortunately, are victims of trafficking, of human trafficking. So this is not to say that migration always happens in this way. Obviously, some people, as I said, just hop on a plane and go from country A to B, and some other people have to have more kind of complex transit phases. Then after kind of sometimes enmeshed with the transit phase, you have the arrival or temporary stay phase, where people arrive to either an intermediary country or the country where they're going to stay. So there's a little bit of so when this happens, when people first arrive to a country, there's uncertainty about whether staying or returning to the country of origin or going to a third country, fourth country. And this also means that sometimes living conditions can be precarious because you don't necessarily have the migratory status figured out. So that can translate into lack of access to basic services and also unemployment or formal employment while you wait for a visa or while not having currently a visa. So these are all factors that have to be taken into account as well for living conditions and kind of possible determinants of mental health. And finally, in the settlement phase, where, you know, someone would say, okay, now I'm going to stay in this country and kind of try to stay for longer. So here you have different processes going on or possibly going on. As I said, this is not how it always happens for everyone, all of these. So there can be a combination of some of them and there's different degrees as well of experiencing these factors or these determinants. So there's the acculturation process. So as I said before, this sort of inclusion process into the arrival society or the settlement country, which is where you kind of negotiate between your own culture or your own cultures and the culture or cultures of the country of arrival. Also, very often people may experience racism and discrimination, unfortunately. This may translate as well into social isolation. And very important is looking at the migratory status of the person. Is it someone who, for instance, entered through a non-authorized crossing path and may never be able to get a residence permit? Or is it someone who's waiting for the residence permit? Is it someone who claimed asylum, for instance, and is going through the very complex and very difficult process of obtaining international protection in the country? This also translates or may translate into implications for employment, so unemployment or underemployment. But also, not everything is bad, obviously, in the cycle of migration. And some people do encounter new opportunities as they settle into the new country and things also look up. This is not all bad, but these are all kind of the determinants that we have to look at when we talk about the mental health of international migrants and refugees. And this is the way in which international migration is a social determinant of mental health. And also very important to take into account that these are also interact with broader social determinants of mental health. So when we look at migration in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is important to take into account that in the last couple of decades, migration flows have been changing. So between 2000 and 2010, so about 10 to 15, 20 years ago, actually, we saw a decline in outward migration to European countries or to North America. So there's this kind of expectation that people from the global South move to the global North, but that's not the whole story. So there's also a lot of intra-regional migration where people move to neighboring countries or to countries within the region. So this has become a more prominent pattern in the way people migrate within, from and within South America and Latin America and the Caribbean. So a little bit more recently, this is a map with a little bit more recent data of what is going on in the Americas in terms of migration. So I think we have to look at first. So if we look at first at the kind of northern area, Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean. So there's a lot of kind of old patterns of migration going towards the US through Mexico, which we always hear about, and this is something that I think most people know about. But there's also more or lesser known migration patterns within the region. So, for instance, people moving from the Caribbean towards South America. So, for instance, people going from Haiti to Brazil and then on to Argentina, onto Chile, onto Peru, and then sometimes back up north through Colombia, Central America, Mexico, and then to the United States. So as I said, these migratory patterns are not straightforward. So it's not necessarily going from country A to country B. So it can be country A to B, C, D, and back to A sometimes. There's also been a lot of migration flows from Venezuela, which we're going to see in a little bit more in detail, to other countries in the region. So either northbound through Panama, Central America, Mexico, and sometimes the United States, or usually to the United States, but also southbound through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and then Chile, Argentina. Also mainly in Brazil and Argentina, there have been patterns of south-south patterns of migration from Africa, mainly from Senegal to Brazil and Argentina. So this is also, I would say, a lesser known pattern of migration, which is very important for the region. So the reasons for migrating within the region are very similar to what I've been describing before, but it's useful to have a look at them a little bit more in detail in this context. So a lot of people obviously move in search of new opportunities based on bilateral and multilateral agreements. So for instance, Mercosur. Also, some people move because of armed conflict, socioeconomic crisis, political crisis, and increasingly environmental and natural disasters. So if we look, as I said, the Venezuelan exodus, as it has been called, has become a very prominent migratory pattern in the region in the past, I would say, 6 years, perhaps, since 2017. And more than 7 million Venezuelan people have moved from Venezuela around the world. And among this 7 million, more than 6 million live in Latin America and the Caribbean. So if we look a little bit closer where Venezuelan people move, so we talk about Venezuelan migrants and refugees. So some people from Venezuela manage to get the refugee status, but most of them don't. So that's why we talk about mixed flows and both refugees and migrants, right? So Venezuelan migrants usually settle to the closest country, which is Colombia, and then some of them go on to Peru, then on to Ecuador, and then on to Chile. So Chile is kind of the fourth country in the region in terms of the amount of Venezuelan migrants and refugees living. And it's about 500,000 people, and this is 5 times less than the amount of people in Colombia, which is very important to point out as well, in terms of the distribution of international of Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the region. There's also a significant amount of Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Brazil, and then Central America, Mexico, usually on the way up to the United States. And some of them also settle in other countries in the Southern Cone, such as Argentina and Uruguay and Bolivia. And some of them as well do settle in the Caribbean, but in lesser proportions. So this is an important thing to take into account, because obviously 6 million people moving around Latin America is a significant amount of people, and this has created a humanitarian crisis has been created as rooted in this exodus. So in different countries in South America and Latin America and Caribbean in general, there's a lot of Venezuelan migrants and refugees kind of seeking new opportunities, but also seeking to obtain the refugee status. So in this context, it's important to look at a specificity of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the Declaration of Cartagena on refugees. So this the declaration is different from the traditional 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees, because it broadens the definition of refugees and encompasses individuals who flee their country due to threats to life, safety, freedom, or factors such as general violence, foreign aggression, internal strife, etc. So this means that some people who may not qualify as a refugee under the 1951 Geneva Convention may qualify as refugee under the Cartagena Declaration. So this is an important thing to take into account, because it means that more people may obtain international protection and may receive residence permits, may have more opportunities to receive a residence permit, which may also have implication for obviously their socioeconomic conditions, living conditions, and mental health. Sorry, I don't know why this went back. So in terms of
brief interruption to say time's up. So if you want to wrap up in a minute for your presentation, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I have a minute left.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I took a long time in kind of looking at migration in Latin America, so I'm going to hurry up a little bit. So the challenges that we see in the region in terms of mental health, have to do with with continuity of care throughout the migration cycle, because of different criteria to access mental health care through our countries and disparities in the quality of mental health care that can be accessed. Also, as I said, potentially dangerous and traumatic migration journeys, discrimination, and everything that has to do with the social processes of social integration. And also we have to say that there's limited policy action based on migration as a social determinant of mental health care. And based on this, there's a bunch of opportunities to be seized in terms of the regional management of international migration, but also having a regional approach to the mental health implications of the migratory crisis through multilateral actions and interventions. And also there's an opportunity to strengthen healthcare systems to better respond to the mental health care needs of migrants and the local population in the region. So very quickly, in terms of migration in Chile, as I said, Chile has been receiving a significant amount of flows from Venezuela, which translates into major changes in the last 10 years in terms of the migration patterns in the country. And also in the past few years, there's been an increase in non-authorized border crossings throughout the northern parts of the country. So we've seen kind of an increase in more precarious and more forced migration patterns in the country, which means that some social determinants of mental health at play in terms of migration in Chile may mean that there is a heightened need for specific mental health care for international migrants, specifically coming from Venezuela, because of the conditions they migrate in and the conditions they may find themselves in Chile. We don't have time to look at the details of how mental health care is kind of approached in Chile. But what are the main issues? Very quickly, what are the main issues in terms of mental health care for the migrant population in Chile? So first of all, there is contextually the health system constraints. So there's a fragmentation between the public and private system, which means that people who are in more precarious living conditions and socioeconomic conditions and who have the most healthcare needs are usually confined to the public system, where they don't necessarily receive the care that they need. There are very important inequities in access, availability, and quality of mental health between the public and private system. And just generally in terms of policies, mental health is not prioritized. So this is kind of the general health system constraints in terms of mental health, which affects migrants and the local population alike. Then international migrants face general barriers to access healthcare. So obviously migratory status is an important one. Lack of information in terms of where people may seek care and receive the care that they need. There is also discrimination and xenophobia from inside the healthcare system, which is an important barrier to accessing and kind of keep seeking care. And also lack of intercultural dialogue within the healthcare system between healthcare providers and international migrants. And very specifically in terms of mental health care. So within this whole context of health system constraints and general barriers to accessing healthcare, there are specific barriers to accessing mental health care. So there's a lack of information surrounding the services available to international migrants. There's a lack of prioritization of the mental health of international migrants. There's a lack of relevance and acceptability of the mental health delivered to international migrants. So they might not be adjusted to what international migrants may be experiencing and may be needing in terms of care. So yes, I have to hurry up. So addressing mental health among international migrants in Chile. Sorry, I'm going to skip a few slides so that we can wrap up. So what are the main questions that one, as a mental health care provider or someone who is a practitioner or someone who is interested in the topic may ask in terms of addressing the mental health of international migrants? So this is relevant to Chile, and this is based on our experience in Chile, but this is also obviously very relevant to the region and other countries. So is an international migrant seeking healthcare, mental health care? So do we have to, so when we look at mental health, when we look at someone who may be seeking mental health, we have to wonder whether the person is experiencing a mental health issue, or is it perhaps a different cultural expression of what they're experiencing, especially the potential strains of international migration. Is it also something that may be interpreted as a mental health issue? Is it just that, or is it, as I said, a different cultural expression, or is it a language gap where we're not understanding what the person may need? Also, there is an issue where the scales used for diagnosis may not be adapted to people from other countries. So it might be validated for people from Chile, but maybe not international migrants. So there may also be misdiagnosis. And also, we have seen in Chile a lot of overdiagnosis based on intolerance and stigma and discrimination, especially among the Haitian population. And finally, something that is really important, because we always talk about we always talk about the needs and the issues, and we kind of tend to see international migrants as people who may have more needs, but also there are people who do have resources and coping strategies to address their own mental health. So it's very important to see this and recognize this and build strategies to address the mental health built on this, to harness also the resources and coping strategies that they have. So we have to look at mental health in international migrations with having in mind the social determinants of mental health. We also have to have in mind human rights standards and cross-cultural health, and we have to develop interventions based on these three concepts. Also, the strategies must be developed based on existing resources and coping strategies of migrant communities and individuals. And also we have to promote the cross-sectoral dialogue and dialogue with migrant communities based on respect and trust. So I'm going to wrap up really quickly because Baltika is looking at me very intently. So these are a few papers that you might be interested in if you want to look more into the topic. And I picked a bunch of them only in English, so that might appeal to a broader audience as well. So sorry, Baltika, for the time. I started speaking quite slowly, and then I realized I had to speed up a little bit.
Yeah.
So there's so much that. Yes.
Don't worry, you've got a lot to share, and your presentation was very comprehensive and informative about the Latin American reality and Chile in terms of migration patterns and its relation to mental health. So thank you so much for that. And I will now head on to Joe Smith, our next presenter. Joe Smith is a consultant dietitian, clinical academic, working between Teesside, ESC, and Ware Valley's NHS Foundation Trust and the Teesside University. Dear Joe, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and experience in the next 20 minutes. As I did with Alice, I'll turn my camera on when you've got around 2 to 3 more minutes left to go. Thank you so much, and please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Baltika. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me today to speak on behalf of Teesside University. And I'm here today to speak to you. I will try to cut down time a little bit so that we run to time, but I'm here to speak on behalf of my team about a study that we've just finished this year, looking at food insecurity for adults with severe mental illness living in Northern England. And this was something that I worked jointly with my colleague, Professor Emma Giles, who unfortunately can't be here today. But I'm speaking on behalf of both of us, as well as the team, who I will mention later on. So just to set the context, and I think that Alice's presentation was really helpful in kind of leading into this next presentation, because I was reflecting on Alice's presentation as she was speaking and thinking about how similar some of the key issues are across the two countries, but also sometimes how our systems are quite different in the UK compared to over in South America. So just to bring everybody up to speed with the situation in the UK. So food insecurity is a rising issue. At the moment, we think it's around 9.7 million adults. So that's 18% of all households are experiencing food insecurity, and 4 million children. And in the UK, 54% of households receiving universal credit. Universal credit is our main government benefit scheme in the UK. So 54% of people receiving that benefit were experiencing food insecurity. So that was just to give you a little bit of a scene setting. So what do we mean by food insecurity? So I'll just let you read that top one. But basically, it's lacking the financial resources that you would require to be able to access enough food, but enough food to meet your dietary, nutritional, and your social needs. And we're talking specifically for this study in relation to people with severe mental illness. And when we talk about severe mental illness, or SMI, as we abbreviate it to, we're talking about the most severe end of the spectrum, if you like, within mental health. So these are people who have conditions such as schizophrenia, other related psychoses, or bipolar disorder. And they tend to be the conditions that would have quite an impact on people's day-to-day life. And we know that people with SMI are a marginalised population in terms of both their physical and their mental health. And the latest data is showing that people with a severe mental illness are more likely to die earlier than the general population, and it's quite a bit earlier, so 15 to 20 years earlier than the general population. So quite a marginalised community. So the research plan that I'm talking today about is in relation to looking at food insecurity for adults with severe mental illness. And we received funding from the NIHR, which is the National Institute for Health and Social Care Research in the UK. And it was a specific piece of research looking at mental health in the north of England. It was an 18-month project which started in September 2021 and ran through till March this year, so 18 months. And I was the National Health Service Chief Investigator, so NHS, alongside Professor Giles, who was acting as the joint academic. So I've only been working in academia for about 3.5 years now, so it was a joint project with a much more experienced academic. So these were our research questions. We wanted to, because there was no UK-based research when we did a systematic review, there was no studies whatsoever undertaken in the UK. So we wanted to look at what prevalence data was for food insecurity in adults with SMI, but also understand their experiences and also possible approaches to overcoming food insecurity. So how do we help people with severe mental illness to be able to access enough food to meet their needs? This was our inclusion criteria. So we were looking at adults aged 18 and above. It was a self-reported diagnosis of severe mental illness. That's because we did an online survey, so we didn't use clinical records to verify that information. But they needed to be resident in Northern England. So for those people who are not familiar with our geography, that was the northwest, so with Liverpool and Manchester, all the way up to the Scottish borders and across the country. And that's just to remind everybody of the definition that we used for severe mental illness. We had 7 National Health Service sites. So just to kind of pay tribute to them really, because they were so helpful with our recruitment. We recruited mainly through the NHS sites, and we had a survey, so an online survey, but we also had paper versions of the survey available because we appreciate with the group of people that we were wanting to speak to, there is quite a high degree of digital poverty, as well as issues with people being able to access the internet. So we made sure we had paper surveys available as well. And we surveyed across the whole of the north of England. So these were the people that we worked closely with. So on to the results, because I know that's the most important part that people want to speak about. So the first thing was to kind of look at the prevalence of food insecurity. And you can see here, if you look at the bottom table on this, that food insecurity, the prevalence was 50.4% of our sample. Our sample was 135, which was what we were looking to achieve. So it was 135 people that we recruited to the survey, and over half of those people met the criteria. We used the US version of the food insecurity measure. That's the kind of gold standard one that is used across the world. So yeah, 50.4%. And just to put that into context, in the UK, the general sort of population estimates are around about 20% of adults or households. So between 18 and 20%. So it is a significantly higher amount of people. And even when you compare it to a systematic review that we've just had accepted for publication, it's still much higher. We looked at high to upper middle income countries, so comparable to the UK, and our prevalence came out as 41%. So it's 10% higher than that as well. So quite concerning statistics. Just to give you a rundown of our participant characteristics. So there you can see, as I say, we had 135 people with a mean age of 44.7. We had a good balance of males and females, but the sample was predominantly white. But we did have people from other backgrounds as well. The one thing that we found was statistically significant in terms of the differences between some of these demographics was where people lived. So what we found, if you look at the bottom row of this table, you will see that people living in the northwest of England had much higher prevalence. So nearly 3/4 of people living in the northwest of England met the threshold for food insecurity. So that's Liverpool, Manchester, and the surrounding areas. And the lowest prevalence was in Yorkshire, which is kind of like Leeds, Sheffield, that kind of area, Doncaster as well. So quite a distinct difference between the regions in the north of England. I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs now. So this is looking at, so we asked people for data on their income, their annual household income. And this slide here shows you quite clearly that food insecurity, as you would expect, the prevalence of food insecurity reduces as people's income rises, which is what you would expect. But what I want to draw your attention to here is that even people who were working with severe mental illness and had a reasonably good income, so the average in the UK is around about £36,000 per year, even people who were working and were having an average income were still experiencing quite a high degree of food insecurity. So people who were earning, as you'll see there in the last but one column, even people who were earning above the average income in the UK were still having a high degree of food insecurity, which kind of is supported by a lot of the conversations about what we call in-work poverty. So people who are working but still struggling in the UK with poverty. I'm just going to show you, we also asked people about their height and weight. So we could look at the difference by body mass index category. And this was really interesting because the vast majority of people who were underweight were meeting the threshold for food insecurity, so around about 3/4. And again, the people at the opposite end of the spectrum, so those people who were meeting the threshold for obesity, again had higher levels, whereas the people who were in the healthy weight range, and particularly the overweight weight range, actually had lower values of food insecurity. We couldn't do a lot with statistics because the sample size was still relatively small, but it's just to highlight this. We also did a binary logistic regression, but I will give you a word of caution on this. Because of the sample size, the confidence interval was incredibly wide. But whichever model we did, we found that people who had one or more child in the household were particularly high risk of food insecurity. As I said, the odds ratio there was over 10, but it does have a very wide confidence interval. But it is giving us an indication that particularly people who have children in the household were experiencing food insecurity. And there were stories within some of the qualitative information that we collected where people were talking about friends having to sell their Xboxes in order to give the person money to buy food for their family, which was really quite heartbreaking, some of the qualitative comments. So I'm now going to move on to our qualitative findings. So further on from the survey, we did some interviews and we wanted to get 20 interviews. So these were people who'd done the survey and volunteered to undertake a semi-structured interview. The interviews were undertaken by peer researchers. So that's people who got lived experience of severe mental illness. And that was because when we did some work leading up to the grant, people talked about wanting not to talk to a researcher about food insecurity, but to a fellow person with severe mental illness. So what we found from the interviews, we got 13 interviews in the end. So we didn't quite get as many as we wanted, but we got a reasonable amount to do some analysis with. So what we found was two main areas: people's experience of food insecurity and their strategies to tackle it. And they were the main kind of questions we asked. So I'll start first of all with the experience of food insecurity. And what we found was people had a long rooted, so it was related to kind of parents having food insecurity, grandparents, so a very much familial food insecurity, unemployment leading to food insecurity, and then a circle of impact, which I think is really interesting, between what comes first. Is it food insecurity, or is it mental ill health, or is it both? So a lot of people talking about food insecurity caused increasing people's mental health conditions, symptoms, but also mental health then leading to food insecurity. No surprise about the impact of fuel poverty, so not having the gas or electric to be able to cook the food that they were delivered. The cost of living crisis, which in the UK at the moment is a real issue. And that meant that people didn't even have the funds to be able to travel to the food banks. So in the UK, we have food banks, which hand out food parcels, but people didn't always have the means to be able to travel to the food banks. There was conversations about the impacts of people with taking medication, so the food insecurity impacts of medication, and people sometimes saying that they had to be able to eat, be able to take their medication, and so therefore that was causing a problem in that people couldn't always take their medication because they hadn't eaten, and also some of the physical barriers to accessing support, such as application forms for food banks. I'm just going to leave them quotes on for a couple of minutes for people to have a little look at. So these are the relation to the experiences of food insecurity. And you can see the application. Thank you. Right, okay, so I'm going to move on quickly to the strategies to tackle food insecurity. So what people were recommending is, and stigma came up in Alice's presentation too, about reducing the stigma around using food banks in the UK, and also being able to cater for different cultures. Thinking about transporting food parcels to people's homes as opposed to them travelling, and also reducing the sugary and canned foods in the food banks and improving access to fresh fruit and vegetables. And the last thing was tackling the root causes to food insecurity, so the underlying issues around things like unemployment and other kind of barriers to actually developing food insecurity in the first place. So they're just some final quotes about what people's thoughts were, and the slides will be available if you want to look at these in more detail. So just kind of final thing from me around recommendations. So at the moment, we don't assess for food insecurity in the UK. So that's really important that we start to ask and to screen for food insecurity, that we look at policy reform in the UK to prevent food insecurity, and that those policies need to address the needs of vulnerable adults, and that any kind of interventions we develop need to be co-produced with people with lived experience, and that we need further research in the UK. This was the first study, so we need to have more research looking at this in the UK. And that's just our final contact details if people have any queries or questions about the research. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was to time.
That was wonderful, Jo. Thank you so much. It was incredibly interesting. And it took us to a different place and scenario related to mental health compared to the previous presentation. So I know we can think of how complex and how multidimensional mental health issues are all over the world. So thank you very much for that. We will now move on to the comments for these two panelists. And the first person to provide her comment is Alexandra Obach. Alexandra, oh, sorry, that was my timing. So Alexandra is an anthropologist with a PhD in social anthropology, a master's in gender studies, and she's the executive director of the Center for Global Intercultural Health at Universidad del Desarrollo in Santiago de Chile. She has been working around mental health issues with different diverse communities in the country and the region for many years. So thank you, Alexandra, for being with us today. You've got 10 minutes to provide your commentary on the topic in general and the past presentations. Thank you so much for being with us today, and the screen is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Baltika, for the invitation. I'm going to try to put my ideas in order. Sorry if my English is not so good, but I'm going to try to do my best to comment these excellent presentations done by Alice and by Jo. Thank you very much for that. It was very satisfying listening to you with the results of your research. I would like to focus my comment on the concept of structural vulnerabilities as a way to focus the conversation, not so much on the individual aspects that place people in a position of vulnerability, but on those structural aspects of society whose modification is beyond the control of individuals, since there are areas that have to do with normative aspects and also with cultural aspects of societies. In this term, both presentations, I think, give us an account of specific exclusions social exclusions that societies make in relation to those who are considered undesirable subjects, as a way of speaking. Both presentations describe structural exclusion process that operates systematically in different areas. In the UK, Joe show us what happens with adults with mental illness that has to do with their access to food, an elemental right that all humans have, no? And in Chile, Alice does it with migrant population. Jo, showing her results in the UK, I think that she describes very accurately in the mechanisms through which the exclusion operates, through which groups of adults with mental illness experience food deprivation, differentiated by regions within the UK, socioeconomic levels, employment, among other variables. In Chile, on the other hand, Alice shows us structural vulnerabilities that becomes more explicit when studied the migration conditions of the latest migratory waves in the country. In addition to the structural barriers that migrants face in terms of migration policies that excludes them from different aspects of our life in society, I would like to focus the discussion in the cultural aspects of the receiving society, in this case, the Chilean one, that makes the migration process difficult and that affect the health of migrants, in particular, mental health. One of these aspects of these cultural aspects has to do with the colonialist approach through which the integration of migrants is proposed by Chilean society in this case. At this point, the idea of the white as the social idea to which the Chilean ideology aspires takes on special importance. For this reason, blackness is rejected, and this entails concrete practice of xenophobia and racism. There is also an ideology that exalts the idea of patriotism, an ideology that excludes from this patriotic belonging those who do not represent the ideal patterns of this citizenship in Chile that is characterized by the whiteness. The social aspirations are experienced by migrants in all social spaces, the streets, schools, job places, and in the health system. And this is very important since health workers are also part of these cultural ideologies, and they reproduce these cultural ideologies in the health system and in the health clinical attention. So this is important to mention that all these processes are experienced differently according to gender, age, gender identity, as well in migrant population. It is important to emphasize that the notion of blackness not only has to do with a particular skin color, but it is a social marker that brings together all those who come from countries considered less developed than Chile. Therefore, there is a huge gap between those who come from Latin America and the Caribbean countries and those who come from the North countries, from those who, for whom those colonizing logics do not operate, the ones that come from Northern countries. I think that this idea of colonialist approach also operates in what Joe showed us in the UK. Because as Alice shows how migrants are affected in their mental health because of this exclusion process, Joe shows us a very similar process, but that has to do with the privation of food with adults in the UK. An aspect that is crucial for all of us to live, and that has to do with human rights, the access to food. But this exclusion process has to do with the ones that we want to exclude, the ones that are in the area of mental illness, and how these structural vulnerabilities operates to, in this way, exclude adults from an essential aspect that is as food. So I think the two presentations, although they have to do with very different populations, very different scenarios, they have this in common, that it's about how we operate nowadays social exclusion, and how the power of the states reproduce the exclusion of some population, and how this is extended to all the areas of society. So there are mechanisms that operates, and those are structural mechanisms that operate to activate those exclusions. So thank you very much for the presentations, and congratulations both for this extraordinary research projects that you talked to us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Alexandra, for your excellent comment. And we will quickly move on to Amelia. She's the other person expert on several topics. She's a professor of public health nutrition at University and an associate director of FUSE, the Center for Translational Research in Public Health. Dear Amelia, it's a pleasure to have you today. Please go on with your comments, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody joining this webinar. Firstly, thanks to both Alice and to Joe for giving us presentations on what has to be some of the most topical issues affecting our societies globally. So as I was listening to the presentations, I was noting down food insecurity, a global issue, mental health, a global issue, migration, a global issue, all of which are affecting people's both physical and their mental health. And I feel like in the noise and the media coverage of these topics, we don't really understand that human story, the fact that people are unwell physically and mentally, and also that people are hungry. And when we think about that and think about the wider issues in terms of the societal structures, so my background is nutrition, I'm more familiar with the food system, and we often talk about a broken food system, particularly in the UK, that has experienced Brexit, which is leaving the EU, and the fallout in terms of food from that, and also what the COVID crisis taught us about our just-in-time food system. And what COVID illustrated was that actually there were a significant proportion of the population living in food insecurity. And then when you go down into population groups, what the work that Joe, Emma and my other colleagues has highlighted are that there are particularly vulnerable population groups that are even more exposed both to mental health issues and also to food insecurity. And contemplating what Alice presented around migration, it just made me think about the massive issues around migration and food access that we're probably seeing not just in the UK, but more globally, and the need to not only understand that from a research point of view, but also the need to address that and think about how we fix those broken systems. The other point that both Alice and Joe alluded to was the fact that working with these communities is not straightforward. And I know Joe's work very well, as I was involved in that, and the need to use what we call peer researchers, so people with lived experience, and the importance of not being judgmental and of having walked in somebody's shoes and that understanding as you not only develop the research, but also disseminate that research. And that's much more meaningful, much more impactful. And I think it's so important that we do not just involve these people in the dissemination bit, but right as we design these research topics, but also I think at the policy level in how we fix these broken systems and address our very unequal societies. So we need to think about, given the global issues around food access, the global issues around migration, the global cost of living crisis, issues around war, issues around food access. What are the underlying structural issues that we can work with both our policy and our practice partners in order to address and change the system and ultimately make it a much better world for all of us in terms of our health, physical and mental, our access to food and our access, importantly, to good food, and also that providing people with safe and secure homes. And as I started, I don't think there are three more important issues aside from climate change that are being discussed in the media at the moment. And I think it's been a fascinating insight. So thank you again to Alice and to Joe, and also to Baltika and Alexandra for their insight and invitation.
Thank you so much, Amelia, for putting everything in perspective, I think, and bringing these issues together along with other global health and public health issues that are so worrisome and complex and dynamic that it's hard to follow and grasp and understand sufficiently to know what to do first and the path to follow in a way to make things work as much as we can. So thank you so much for that. And after these two comments, we're going to move on to some questions and answers that are going to be led by my dear colleague, Faye Dean. Faye is a senior lecturer in chiropractic from University and UK representative for public health for the World Federation of Chiropractic and a researcher in integrated health. Dear Faye, thank you for being with us today. You can turn your camera and your mic on. Thank you so much. So please do feel free to grasp one or two questions to everyone, or selecting one or two panelists or people who have done their comments so that we can continue this reflection and shared experience and knowledge. Thank you very much, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you, everybody. Apologies it's so dark in here. I've just had to relocate after some poor signal, so hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you, everybody, for your presentations. They were so interesting, and there were also some really useful summaries as well. Going off of what Amelia, you've just been mentioning, what became really apparent to me whilst listening to Joe's presentation was the concept of health literacy and how that fit into the research that you'd done. And I wondered whether it had been adjusted for, whether there were any plans to maybe look into health literacy alongside that mental health concept. Because obviously you mentioned that there is some digital poverty. And I don't have any background in nutrition, but I do know from a public health point of view that obviously weight doesn't equal, so how heavy somebody weighs doesn't necessarily equal their nutritional status. So you can still be malnourished as well as being overweight or obese. So I just thought health literacy was a really important concept there. And I wondered if you kind of knew any more about that or were planning to research it.
Thank you, Faye. That's a really good question, and it is something that there has been some research done in the UK looking at kind of specific to the population, so people who have a severe mental illness, and I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but it was over 40% of people in that group didn't have basic IT skills in particular, so it was looking at the IT skills, but we do know health literacy is a particular issue. One of the key things that I didn't get a chance to cover there in the presentation, the top thing that came out from the survey when we asked people, what do you need to help you to have enough access to food really surprised me. The top thing that people wanted was more education about healthy eating on a budget, and I didn't expect that. I just didn't see that coming. So that was quite a shock. Having worked 26 years in mental health settings as a dietitian, I didn't think that people would ask for that, but that was the top thing people wanted. So I think future research and my PhD in particular need to kind of factor in some of that education side of and how to make that accessible for people with severe mental illness.
And I think what's positive about that is that people are aware that they don't know potentially how to, create the best nutritional plate and how to do that on a budget, like you say. There's obviously, I know Amelia specialises in the cost of food and taxes, etc. So that's really interesting, and good luck in your PhD studying that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I've got a question for Alice. I thought your study was, your research and your speech was really, really interesting. I saw a slide and it said that between 2018 and 2022, there were roughly 127,000 refugees and migrants into Chile. And it actually said underneath it that 30% of those were minors. Now, just from my experience, I know from teaching about mental health in children that most mental health issues are established by kind of 16 to 18 years of age, and 75% of mental health disorders are completely established by 24. So I just wondered what the if you knew any research in Chile that had looked into the effect of that looking forwards, because obviously that's huge numbers of refugees and migrants, and then the implications of that for the public health policies looking forwards will be obviously affected. So I wondered if you could provide or shed any more light on that.
Thank you, Faye, for your question. So if I understand well, you were talking about underage people, so children and teenagers. Yeah. So actually, this is something that is starting to be more systematically researched, especially in Chile. We've actually conducted with other colleagues from the group a comprehensive study, a mixed method on the health of young, not just young children and teenagers, migrant children and teenagers in Chile. And it wasn't specifically focused on mental health, but there was a lot of mental health that emerged from especially from the interviews that were done. And a few very, very worrying results came out from that, especially for teenagers, surrounding bullying at schools, bullying of young teenagers, migrant teenagers in school settings, not only by peers, but also by parents and also some teachers. So I think this is something that we're going to have to focus on and start hindering. This is something that's going to have to be made visible, and something that is going to have to be addressed at policy level and also more local level in different schools. And also there's a need to sort of change narratives around migration, and especially with children, because migrant children are going to be part of the future of Chile in terms of social inclusion, work, and from a public health perspective, it doesn't make sense to have part of the population being discriminated and bullied and suffering mental health issues as a result, especially in the long run. So I think this is something that needs to be urgently addressed, the mental health of children and teenagers in Chile.
Thank you for that response. That was really interesting. And like you say, it is worrying, isn't it? It's quite concerning, and it's good to kind of explore what's happening and who's studying or researching this at the moment. So thank you for your answer. I wondered as well if, I know in the UK, depression and anxiety form the most common mental health disorders seen here. Is that the same in the migrant and refugee population, would you say?
Yes. Yes, I don't have the numbers in mind, but I think these are the most prevalent ones. But also there's there is a movement towards understanding the interplay between migration and mental health in a way that is not necessarily going towards pathology. So understanding as well that there might be some strain as a result of the migratory process that may not lead to necessarily to mental illness in the long run. So this is also something that needs to be further researched and further understood. And that's something that's kind of in development in Latin America and in Chile as well.
Okay.
Of broader aspects of mental health.
Absolutely, it's complex, isn't it? It's so complex. I actually think listening to all these presentations that there's a perfect research study looking at food insecurity and mental health in migrant and refugee populations, and you guys should collaborate.
I was thinking about that. Yes, that's something that came up as well for me.
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much. That concludes my questions, but thank you. It's been really insightful.
Thank you so much, Faye, for dealing with these really interesting and deep questions that provided more reflections around the topics that we are discussing today. Faye, there is also a question by Sonia in the Q&A section. Would you like to address that one as well?
Apologies.
In the last few minutes we've got. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Okay, so I'm going to read the question out. It's striking to see the major theme coming up is the kind of health education and then digital is the kind of health education and then digital literacy. It's an issue too. Would you say that health education and digital literacy are correlated? So information might be there, but people just don't know how to access it. Who would like to answer that question, Joe? I can see you've appeared.
Yeah, happy to take that one. And then obviously if Alice has got anything to add. From my clinical experience, I would say yes, definitely. I think there's a lot of information out there. My background is working a lot within weight management, so obesity and mental health. And we know that there's lots and lots of things out there for people to access, but they don't. And it's thinking about why do people really struggle to access that? And more times than enough, there's things around stigma and confidence to access, but a lot of the time people just don't know what is available to help them, whether that be food insecurity, whether that be the weight. So there's a disconnect there, and part of our role as health professionals is to be aware of what is available in our local area and help people to know about it and actually overcome the barriers to accessing that as well. And that's a really important role as health professionals. Yeah, I don't know if Alice has got anything else to add.
Yes, actually, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Faye, and thank you, Sonia, for the question. I think that in the context of international migration, I think adding to that is that the health education delivered has to be culturally relevant and obviously linguistically relevant, but more importantly, culturally relevant, and taking into account the diversity of the ways in which health is conceptualized from different cultures and in different countries, and what it means to be healthy and what it means to have healthy coping strategies or strategies in general to manage one's own health, I think is extremely important. Because I think in Chile there is information, but it's not necessarily shown in a way that is culturally relevant. So I think this definitely affects the general health of international migrants, and that's probably the case in different countries, in other countries as well.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Joe. I also think sometimes that, like you say, Alice, it's the context, isn't it, in which the environment you're working or operating in. I think sometimes there's a case of too much information, and it can be quite confusing when you think about. Most people look at different diets. There's intermittent fasting, there's keto, and it's really in-depth information that's quite confusing what people should do to try and eat healthiest, and what's best for their immune system, and what's best for their brain, and what's best for energy. And I think sometimes that can also be an issue. So thank you ever so much, and thank you for the question, Sonia.
Thank you, dear Faye and panelists, for your questions and answers. I think we're reaching the end of this wonderful seminar. This is our third seminar or webinar entitled Mental Health Challenges in Complex Modern Societies, the Cases of Chile and the UK. Thank you so much to all panelists. those who have presented, those who have commented on, and of course, Faye dealing with questions and answers. Thank you to those who are following us within the Zoom, through UDD TV streaming live, and also those who might see us afterwards. It has been a pleasure to be the hostess of this webinar, and I wish you all the very best. See you